In this video, we're going to give a flyover history of the English Bible in 10 different versions. There are, of course, many more versions than this, but these are 10 of the most significant versions of the Bible as they relate to the English translations. Not all of them, as we will see, are going to actually be English translations, but they are all important for what would become the English translations or English versions of the Bible. We begin with number 10, Hebrew Bible or Old Testament text. And it's important to note the plural on the texts here. There was never a time when the Hebrew Bible was one single entity. It was not written from beginning to end in one sitting. So it's always been multiple. And this is the case also with individual Hebrew texts, that there are a variety of different texts of Genesis, though they largely say mostly the same thing and are largely mostly consistent with one another. But we have, from the very beginning of the Hebrew Bible, we have variety and diversity. There is not just one single Hebrew text that stands at the beginning of our line of Hebrew translations that would become English translations of the Bible. Then over to number 9, we get the Hebrew texts of the Hebrew Bible eventually published into Greek, which would be the lingua franca, or the common language of the Greco-Roman Empire, and many Jews in the Second Temple period. So for the New Testament authors, they are largely working from Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible. And notice again, I use the plural there, Greek translations, that there would have been multiple different translations of each individual Hebrew Bible book into Greek. The Septuagint wasn't necessarily just one single thing, but was largely a committee translation, just as today many English Bible translations are committee translations. And just as the Hebrew Bible texts of the Old Testament were not singular in the ancient world, neither were the New Testament texts. That there were a variety of different versions of the Gospel of Mark and a variety of different versions of the Gospel of John, though they were largely consistent with one another. At some places, in some small ways, mostly, they might differ from one another, but there was never a time when the New Testament existed from beginning to end. It was not written from beginning to end in one go, but is a collection or a library of multiple different texts that existed in multiple different forms until eventually the texts of the New Testament and the texts of the Hebrew Bible were collected together. But for their early histories, they were collected together not in one single bound volume, not in one single book, but existed more individually or existed in groups. You might have some letters existing together or a collection of the Gospels existing together. But for the very early history of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, we don't have one single collection, one single edition of these things. That does start to change, however, when we move towards the Latin Vulgate. So before the Latin Vulgate, we also had a variety of different editions of what is called the Old Latin, that any given biblical text would probably have several different Latin translations or Latin versions to it. You get a little bit more consistency with the figure of Jerome in the 4th century, who translates the Bible, the entire Bible, into Latin. Whether or not it was collected into one volume at this point is somewhat contentious, but eventually what would become the Latin Vulgate, largely based on Jerome's Latin translation, would become bound in one single volume. So we start to see in the 4th, 5th, 6th century all of the books of the Bible coming together, being understood to exist as a canon in that period, and in that period and following, being bound together. So here on the screen we have a picture of Codex Amiatinus from about 700 CE, a really massive Bible that is the oldest extant Latin codex of the entire Bible. So that we have we have the Bible all together in one single book by 700, but in Latin. Our number 7 here, when it comes to important texts for English versions of the Bible, we jump forward several hundred years to the 1380s with the Wycliffe Bible, which was an English translation that came from the Latin Vulgate. So the Wycliffe Bibles, we should think of them as sort of coming out in pieces and not existing as an entire Bible until the 1380s. So they sort of went through a process of being available in pieces before coming together as one single Wycliffe Bible in the 1380s. But this Bible has the sort of honor of being the first complete English Bible. And the Wycliffe Bible at this point is before the printing press, which would not be invented until the mid 15th century, so 1450s. So the Wycliffe Bible would have been a handwritten or a manuscript version of the Bible in English. We get the first printed Bible, first complete printed Bible in English in 1535, so about 80 years or so after the invention of the printing press. The Bibles were printed in other vernacular languages, particularly German, for several decades before being printed in English in its entirety, with the Coverdale Bible, also sometimes called the Great Bible. The Coverdale Bible, or the Great Bible, completed the work of a man named William Tyndale, who was really influential in creating English New Testaments, using the Greek that Martin Luther had used, and was a sort of strong advocate for making the Bible available in English. So the Coverdale Bible, the Great Bible, is not Tyndale's Bible. It's not. It's based on Tyndale's Bible, but it's sort of like a completion and an updating of it. And it was approved by Henry VIII for use in England, for the church in England. So it's the first official complete English Bible that was printed. Number 5, we have the Geneva Bible, which is the Bible of the Protestant exiles in the city of Geneva, which is why it's called the Geneva Bible. It's sort of known as the Reformers' Bible, the Bible translated by Reformers. And it's the first Bible to sort of very prominently use verse and chapter divisions, as well as marginal notes and even illustrations. So you can see in this image here, we've got some notes along the side. We've got an illustration right in the middle of the page. We've got page numbers. We have verse numbers, which makes it very, very readable for the individual. So the Geneva Bible came monumentally popular as sort of an individual product for the Bible read by individuals. The Bible was, with the Protestant Reformation, really getting into the people's hands. Number 4, we had the King James Bible, or what is often called the Authorized Version. And the King James Version was meant to be somewhat of a rival to the Geneva Bible. There was an earlier rival to the Geneva Bible called the Bishop's Bible that was commissioned by the Church of England. The King James Bible sort of was largely based on, or was a revision of, the Bishop's Bible, and it was done by committee. And of course, we all know the King James Bible because of its monumental stature and because of its beauty. And this beauty and monumental stature is sort of by no accident. The committee that created this Bible was an all-star committee of scholars. And so the King James Bible sort of became the best English translation that had yet to exist as to its style, and would remain that way for several hundred years. And it would be revised and updated in sort of minor ways for the next 200 years or so, but largely stood as sort of the Bible for about 200 years before it was revised after several other versions sort of began to proliferate after the KJV was published. But after about 200 years, there began to as language sort of had updated and changed, people began to see a need for a revision to the KJV, to update it with respect to language, but also with respect to new Greek and Hebrew texts and new modes of scholarship that had emerged sort of in the Enlightenment period. So the main product of the need for this update was what is called the Revised Version, which is a revision of the King James Version. The first part of it, the New Testament, generally speaking, when translations happens, the New Testament comes out first because it's shorter, can be completed more quickly. The New Testament was published in 1881 with quite a bit of fanfare attached to it. And then the entire Bible, the rest of the Bible completed, the Old Testament completed in 1885, and then eventually the Apocrypha also being revised and released in 1895. So despite the fact that the Revised Version sort of updated the KJV in style and with respect to scholarship, it didn't really come to replace the KJV. The King James Version still remained very, very popular, but what the Revised Version did was really opened up the possibility for revisions, and it really opened up the possibility to utilizing the best of biblical scholarship and utilizing new manuscripts in new translations of the Bible. It's also worth noting that the Revised Version was a sort of an effort across the sea. That is to say, both in England and both in America, teams were working on this revision, which made it take a little bit more time, but also gave it a bit more of a sort of global sensibility, or we might say a more Western sensibility, insofar as the language was sort of appropriate both for English speakers and American English speakers. In 1952, the Revised Standard Version came out, which was another fresh revision of the KJV, largely based on the Revised Version. And once again, it modernized the English and used the tools of textual criticism. One of the biggest things that it did, the biggest changes that it made, was removing the these and thous of the King James Bible. It removed the these and thous except for the case of God. So with the case of God, these and thous were still used to sort of maintain that formal air. The other thing about the Revised Standard Version is that it included the apocryphal books, and it became really an ecumenical Bible. That it was sort of, especially in its later revisions, was supported by Protestants, by Roman Catholics, and by Eastern Orthodox Christians. And finally, the last book, the last English version on sort of the history of importance of English versions. And please note that these are also not 10 least important, 1 most important. These are just in chronological order. The New International Version, which was published in 1978 and became hugely popular with the sort of boom of evangelicalism in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. In many ways, the New International Version was sort of a conservative reaction or revival to the RSV, which the sort of committee of the New International Version had seen thought that there was some sort of liberal ideological and theological creep happening in the RSV. And so it sort of updated the language and sort of removed what it saw to be some of that liberal ideological creep. And the NIV was even more idiomatic and even more modernized than the RSV, which gave it a sort of broad appeal. It had even more readability than the RSV did, and it also had sort of international acclaim insofar as it was an international committee that worked on the New International Version. So because the NIV was so readable and because it had sort of cachet across the world, it became a monumentally popular version of an English translation of the Bible.